time now. What's up, Exorcist fans? Pete here from the Lacercast, and I am wearing a ridiculous party hat because my daughter just turned 13 today. And Danny, I am excited because you have a young daughter too. I think once they reach a certain age, you don't have to worry about them getting possessed by Pazuzu anymore.
Yeah, but you don't want to have those crazy Fabio Patrick Ewing dreams.
Yes, and those can go all the way up until like your 60s or so.
Yeah, the background is still Hills Have Eyes, right?
It's been a crazy couple of days. I haven't made a new background, but yeah. For people that are kind of confused with what the fuck is going on, basically, Danny and I are here today to talk about The Exorcist Part 3. Yes, I do have a Hills Have Eyes background from our Wes Craven month, but we have moved on to our Exorcist month that we're going to have here at the Lacercast. We're going to talk about The Exorcist 3, and then we're going to be covering the Exorcist TV show, all in anticipation for this eventual Exorcist movie. Right now, is it a remake or what's the movie that's coming out?
So it's David Gordon Green has a planned trilogy. I don't think he's doing a straight remake. I think it's kind of going to be like what the Halloween 2018 idea was, but at least this time it sounds like a trilogy is planned out in advance.
Yeah.
Whereas I think he planned out a really good follow-up to Halloween and then was like, wow, that made a lot of money. Shit, we have to make 2 sequels. And they had no idea what to do in those sequels. And I think it really does show when you try to rewatch them and they make almost no narrative sense.
Right. Well, so why would they give him access to like one of the most beloved, horror franchises after Halloween Kills?
Because Halloween 2018 killed at the box office. It was one of the most successful movies of that year. And I think when it comes to horror, I think he's shown he's a capable filmmaker.
Yeah.
I don't think it was like the filmmaking was the problem. It wasn't like an amateur garbage movie. I think that the success of the first of Halloween 2018 kind of rushed sequels that weren't planned, and they didn't know what direction they wanted to take. They made a bizarre time jump. They obviously the controversial addition of like a brand new main character in part 3 of a trilogy, which, to bring us back to The Exorcist 3, is kind of refreshing because this movie, 17 years after the original, brings back 2 central characters, actually 3 central characters from the original film. Lieutenant Kinderman, this time played by the freaking legendary George C. Scott.
Yeah.
Father Dyer, played this time by Ed Flanders, who I love and I wish we would have gotten more of in this movie, because I think my favorite parts of this movie are Kinderman and his interactions in the first third.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we get glimpses of Father Damien Karras back, played again by Jason Miller. So this movie ties right back to that original, giving you characters that even if you didn't remember them, you remember the names of the characters. And you're like, oh, Kinderman. Oh, that's the same. Oh, that was Lee J. Cobb in the original. Oh, shit. Okay.
Right.
And they actually upgrade the actor. No discredit to Lee J. Cobb. 12 Angry Men, freaking love Lee J. Cobb. I think he might even be an Oscar winner.
Yeah.
But George C. Scott is on another level in this movie. I fucking love him so much in this.
Yeah, it's funny. I feel the exact same thing. I haven't seen him in anything else. He's Patton in Patton, right?
Yeah.
And then I know that you're a big fan of The Changeling too. He's in that, right?
Oh, he's fantastic in The Changeling.
Yeah.
In fact, if you put this and that together, I mean, he's kind of like a little hidden gem of genre films. I would put The Changeling up there as one of the maybe top 2 or 3 greatest ghost story horror movies ever made. And my all-time favorite George C. Scott performance is Dr. Strangelove.
Oh, okay. I have seen that. Yeah.
I mean, that's probably in my top 10 to 20 movies of all time.
Yeah.
Everybody in that movie is fucking great.
He's so good in this. I mean, okay, I don't even know where to start with this movie. It's certainly like of its time. You know, you and I, we've kind of talked about a couple of movies that have come out in the early 90s, late 80s. There's something about that time period that's very special for me. I feel like the horror movies are real imaginative. The shots and stuff they use in the early 90s, late 80s are real creative and dynamic and interesting. And this movie is a good example of that. And then it's also like really disturbing and gritty. And what's interesting about this movie in general is that there's like fucking horrific, awful stuff that happens in this movie, but you actually don't really see that much gore.
This is one of those weird movies where, you know, the expression, you know, show don't tell. This movie does a lot of telling.
Yeah.
And not a lot of showing. Almost no showing at all.
Right, right.
But the way everything is described.
Yep.
It makes you so uncomfortable, and it almost tricks you into thinking you've seen gory stuff that isn't there. Even, you know, the elephant in the room, probably the greatest jump scare moment in horror history. It was ranked very highly in Shudder's 101 Scariest Horror Movie Moments. The scene in the hospital, where the woman locks the door and then all of a sudden, you don't see anything. You see this incredible pan zoom, and then you see the guy dressed in white with the shears, and then it flashes immediately to the beheaded statue. Yeah. There's almost no bloodshed in this movie whatsoever, except for one fairly gory moment towards the end, with the Exorcist who comes in at the end of the film.
Yes.
Which, I don't know if you saw this, because to me, this movie is, for 2/3 of this movie, maybe even 3/4 of this movie, I think it's fucking perfect.
Yeah.
And that last 10 minutes is a little,
Yeah.
And from everything I've read, William Peter Blatty, the author of The Exorcist, the Oscar-winning writer of The Exorcist, who wrote the book Legion, which was effectively a literary sequel to The Exorcist, he wrote and directed this movie, and he didn't want this to almost be connected at all. In fact, the name of his book is Legion. He wanted the title of the movie to be Legion. And the studio, of course, was like, look, The Exorcist Part 3 will sell.
Yeah.
And they realized at the end of the movie that there were no exorcists or exorcisms in the movie. And they were like, shit. Okay, well, if we're going with that as the title, we should probably go back and film some sequences with an actual exorcist, or else the movie doesn't really make sense. And so that whole character of Father Morning and that whole weird ending where he goes in to do, he's treated in the movie like he's this major character that we should be like that the Gemini killer needs to be afraid of.
Right.
And to the viewer, it's just like, I'm sitting there and I'm going, was this a character from the original that I don't remember?
Yeah.
Is there a scene in like an alternate cut that I don't remember? It feels very forced. And then you get the ending that I think Blatty wanted, but it feels kind of tacked on to this bizarre exorcism scene in the cell at the end of the movie.
Yeah.
I almost would have rather, I don't think the movie would have the reputation. I think, you know, sometimes the studios are right. I think the reason The Exorcist III is as known as it is in horror circles is because it's The Exorcist III.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this movie would have come out and it would have just been called Legion and it would have had a slightly different ending. I don't know if it would be remembered the same way. But the ending is weird.
I mean, 100% agree. It's funny because the way that this movie is shot, there are a couple of different sequences where you see like priests and, you know, a couple of priests get murdered. There's, you know, you mainly focus on George C. Scott throughout the whole movie, but every so often we have these random scenes with other characters. A lot of times they're priests, right? Or they're people in that home or whatever, the institution. Then you do have this one exorcist priest that you're talking about, and he's in a very random scene just out of nowhere, and you're like, wait, what is this? What does this have to do with anything? And then he shows up at the very end in the third act, and it's like, oh, okay, now this guy's gonna have a showdown with the beast. Okay, so it's jarring, but it still kind of works. I actually like that end sequence quite a bit. I thought it was very epic and interesting. Going back to kind of what I was saying about how the 90s, the early 90s, we covered The People Under the Stairs a couple of weeks ago for our Wes Craven month. There's something about that time period where just the way that movies looked, because obviously everything is still practical. We're not in that CGI age yet, but like it's really ambitious, because I think it's probably like an influence of the maturity of like music videos from that time, right? Music videos obviously like really became big in the 80s, but then like they started to get real creative and weird and dark and stuff in the late 80s, early 90s. And I feel like movies reflect that.
I'm going to hit you with my favorite music video of all time, which feels like it could have been a cutscene in this movie.
Okay.
You could probably guess it if you've seen it.
Some with Nine Inch Nails, I'm guessing.
You're close. No, not really. You're not really close.
Okay.
REM, Losing My Religion.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, there you go. Okay, that works.
I mean, I remember, so I didn't have cable growing up. So, like, me getting to see MTV was always this rare thing. Like, if I went to a friend's house or my grandparents who had cable. And I remember seeing that video, and there's, like, angels, and there's people, like, reaching into the angels. And I'm like, what's happening here? Like,
yes.
I really like this song, but what the hell's going on? And that feels like it could have been a dream sequence in this movie, because the dream sequence in this movie is one of the most bonkers scenes I've ever seen in any movie.
I love it.
I think one of my all-time favorite low-key lines is, "Oh, hi, Thomas. I'm sorry you were murdered." It's just the most. It's the most ridiculous scene. Do you know that Samuel L. Jackson is sitting there in the dream sequence? If you watch it again, he's the blind man who's sitting there, and he has one line, and that one line is dubbed.
Oh,
so
okay.
He's just randomly sitting there. Fabio is there. Patrick Ewing of the Knicks in like his prime, 1990 Patrick Ewing is the angel of death, who's sitting there with Father Dyer, who had just been drained of all of his blood and decapitated.
Yeah. So disturbing. I love depictions of heaven that are kind of weird. That makes me really happy. Like a lot of times, like the typical depiction of heaven is like, oh, there's a loved one and you're like in a field or something. I love it when it's like there's weird shit, like there's like angels. Like, I love Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey when they go to heaven. And this kind of reminded me of that a little bit. Right. It's just so like weird, and it's just like this collection of all different people that kind of seem like innocent and happy, but then there's stuff where you're like, wait, what is going on here? And I like the band that was playing, and
I like the idea that if you were killed via decapitation, that they staple your head back on. That there's these like giant staple marks.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah, but like the thing I keep kind of drilling home is that this kind of movie, you just don't see something like this nowadays in theaters. Maybe on some kind of TV show, like a streaming show. But to have a weird dream sequence like that, then to have like the dialogue that you have between George C. Scott and like Father Dyer, like I love that sharp kind of dialogue where they're just bouncing off each other, ribbing each other. He has that whole fucking speech where he talks about a carp.
The carp in the bathtub.
The carp in the bathtub.
Like, that is one of the great scenes. It makes no sense. It doesn't fit in any movie.
Right.
And like, unless you're making like a comedy where your in-laws come and stay with you and you're forced to deal with your in-laws.
Right.
And he's telling, if you notice, I smell because I haven't showered in 3 days because there's a carp in my fucking bathtub. It's like, what is happening here?
Yeah. It's so good. And I guess that's what happens when you have a guy who wrote the book also write the screenplay and direct it. It's just under his control, his vision. I think that he and William Friedkin didn't necessarily see eye to eye on The Exorcist. I'm not 100% sure.
Well,
I think I've said.
I
Go
think
ahead.
William Friedkin is like an admitted like absolute bully on set,
Oh
and
yeah.
I watched the documentary that was on Shudder of an interview with William Friedkin all
Oh,
about The
okay.
Exorcist, and he was just like, like there are stories from The Exorcist, and they've been covered in things like Cursed Films and all these other documentaries about like Linda Blair was like permanently injured, forced to do like the scene where she's like flinging back and forth because she was in this harness.
Right.
There's all like Eileen Brennan, I think the mom was like thrown all over. Oh, Ellen Bernstein, Eileen Brennan.
Yeah, I know. I was kind of like, wait a minute, who?
I think I don't know. Ellen Bernstein, she was like flung all over the place, and you know, Friedkin seems like a guy who goes onto a set and he's like, "Here's the movie we're making. Let's get to fucking work."
Yeah.
Whereas, it's very interesting though to have somebody who wrote the book actually direct the movie. Perks of Being a Wallflower, I know, was done that way also. The author of the book, who's Stephen something, I don't know, but he wrote that book, and then he wrote the screenplay and the movie. It's very rare.
Stephen Chbosky. It's like
Chbosky, yes.
Chbosky. Yeah. Yeah. No, I know. Like Friedkin. Okay, so here's the thing, right? You said something kind of controversial recording ago, and Brian Keene, horror author Brian Keene, one of my favorites. I mentioned I was recording about this movie, and he said like, "Oh, The Exorcist III is this fucking like." He just had so much praise for this movie, and I think he might have even said that like it's better than the first one. I know you have said that you like it better than the first one.
I'll clarify my opinion on that. I don't want to be too high on the hot seat. As a horror fan, I think The Exorcist holds its place in like the Mount Rushmore. I think as a film, it is an experience that needs to be appreciated. It does things that have never been done before, that have been attempted since, and failed miserably. It's one of the greatest horror movies ever made.
Right.
If I had 2 hours to kill, and you're asking me which one I would rather watch,
right,
or which one I would rather rewatch, it's Exorcist 3. I think it's a weird word to use, but it's a more fun watch. Like we were just talking about, you have this, it feels like, because The Exorcist is really about Regan and her mother, and all the other characters, even Karras, who's like probably the third lead in that movie, he's kind of, his story is kind of fascinating, but the mom-daughter stuff, it doesn't lend to a lot of like fun dialogue. Whereas here, Kinderman and Dyer are like the oldest of friends. They're characters from the 1973 movie, so they've known each other for at least 15 years. And they get together all the time. They go to the movies. Their dialogue feels so fun and natural. It feels like old friends getting together and shooting the shit the way that, old friends do.
Yes.
And the way that George C. Scott interacts with the officers that he works with, the way he interacts with Dr. Temple, the way Scott Wilson, the way he interacts with Father Karras, and with the Gemini Killer, played by a guy we haven't mentioned yet, Brad friggin' Dourif. And I think that is the main thing that I love about this movie so much. It's that the quality of the actors, the whole idea, The Exorcist was very show with a little bit of telling so that the audience understood what was happening. This movie is mostly telling, but the people telling the story are just people you could listen to, actors who have such a command of the screen, great voices. Like when you're going back and forth between Brad Dourif, Jason Miller, and George C. Scott in that cell, like there are probably people that are like, God, this is boring. Like, why aren't they like showing all of these crimes? I'm fascinated. I'm like glued to my friggin' chair watching this. So happy to like listen to these guys tell this story.
Right.
Yeah.
Dude, that is so well put what you just said. I kind of feel like what I'm going to say is kind of redundant, but I just kind of want to add on to that. Like, I was saying before that with the original Exorcist, I actually really enjoyed watching like the behind the scenes stuff. There's been multiple documentaries. You mentioned a couple already about the Exorcist. I think that the Exorcist is such like a sensational movie. Like when it came out, and they're saying, people were like running out screaming when they saw the trailers, and people were throwing up in the theater. It was this big sensation,
Yeah.
right? And everyone, when you watch it, it's kind of like a rite of passage. Like when you're a teenager or preteen, you're like, oh, did you see it? Oh, she's doing this thing with the crucifix. Her head spins around. She says all this dirty stuff. This movie is filled with really, really gruesome dialogue, but it is almost like a stage play. And I think I'm more interested in watching this than the original, because there are these scenes where it's just literally, I was looking at it, I'm like, okay, it's just a shot of Brad Dourif and George C. Scott sitting across from each other. There's that shot, and then it'll be Brad Dourif's face. Then George C. Scott, and the thing is that you're just fucking captivated just based on performance alone.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Go ahead. Finish up.
No, I was gonna say, like, me, that I'm a big Brad Dourif fan, and it's kind of ridiculous that I'm a fan of him, and then I didn't even fucking see this movie before, because like he's just ridiculous in this. They add this like little effect to his voice that it's that effect that they've used for like demonic creatures in general, and maybe they're kind of inspired by this, but it's that sort of that. Like it sounds like it's multiple voices in one, but it's just like an amplification of his voice. And it does this thing where it's almost like kind of gender neutral. And I've definitely seen this in other movies where things are possessed. And like it's just a slight variation on his voice, but it's so fucking creepy. And the way that he says things and the look in his eyes, it's so good.
This movie, I think the best word to describe Blatty, especially in this movie, is patience. This movie is so patient with what it does. Like that jump scare, the camera basically lingers in one spot at the end of a hallway for nearly 4 to 5 minutes of screen time.
Right.
And there's very few cuts to the nurse. Then she goes down the hall. She has that like fake out jump scare where the patient scares her.
Right.
Then then the camera is back in place. She walks all the way down the hall. There are the two cops at the end of the hallway that are like there. Then they leave. Then they come back. Then they leave again. Then one comes back in and goes the other way. And as all of that is happening, she's checking the room. She hears a noise. And it's so fucking patient to do that.
Right.
And I think that's why that jump scare is so effective, because it almost lulls you into this false sense of security. Especially, I remember I showed it to Charlotte when this was on The Last Drive-In a couple of seasons ago. And I played that scene for her. And I said, this is the greatest jump scare ever. And the nurse got scared by the patient. And she went, huh? And she's like, that's not that bad. And I was like, all right, I guess it doesn't scare you. I guess you're much better. And then she just sat and we kept watching the movie. And then when that scene happened, she was like, oh, shit.
That's fucking great. Yeah, I mean, it's this iconic scene. And the thing is, right, for its time, for 1990, for something that's like, I guess, like what, over 30 years ago now, right? Like, what is the equivalent of that? Like, there's nothing like that in the 90s. It's a much more modern kind of thing to just be stuck on the frame like that. It's like some kind of Coen Brothers thing, or like something that you get from like a prestige television show these days. It's really weird to see that in 1990.
Yeah.
It's ahead of its. Go ahead.
No, it is ahead of its time. And like so much of the imagery in this movie is so weird, and it sticks with you. Like there's that one flash scene to like the statue of the angel, but with the Joker fucking makeup on it.
Yeah.
And,
what's up with that?
There's all this weird imagery. It's just a phenomenally strange movie. And it's about like, serial killers. It's about possession. It's about, mind control in a way, brutal killings.
In a way, it kind of predates Seven too. I wonder if this was any kind of influence on like David Fincher and Seven, right? Because a lot of it is about good and evil and just how fucking depressing and disturbing the world is, especially through the lens of a homicide detective. When George C. Scott, he's describing this murder at the very beginning of the movie of this African American boy, and when he describes it to Father Dyer, right? Like it's like he's talking to Father Dyer and he's like, "This is what I saw," and then Father Dyer just kind of has this reaction. And I wasn't really expecting what it's so like over the top. They're like, well, he was drugged and then they like crucified him and they chopped off his head. It's like so.
It also, I'll tell you what else it reminded me of. It reminded me of Hannibal, the TV show.
Oh, okay.
With some of the staged, like, tableaus. That's it. That Hannibal Lecter did in that show. And then it also reminded me, did you watch Dexter?
First like 3 or 4 seasons.
Okay, then you don't need to watch anymore. But in season 6 of Dexter, there was the killer created these tableaus of like the victim, and it reminded me of that. And I wonder, how much did the creators of those shows and even Seven with the whole setting, like the stage of a murder as like something to be seen, it feels very much like it could have been borrowed or, inspired by The Exorcist III.
Right. And I guess this must be like a theme in William Peter Blatty's work, which is the idea of demons trying to show the ugliness of the world or like how horrible the world can be. Because obviously that's a big point of dialogue in The Exorcist, what's his face? Max von Sydow, his exorcist is talking about that to Father Karras a lot. And he's like trying to like make Reagan look like she's unclean or just show how horrible the world can be. And then like at the end of this movie, during the climactic battle, the fucking demon has George C. Scott up against the wall, and George C. Scott's like, I believe in filth and horror and murder. Like he's just listing all the horrible things about humanity. And you don't for a second think that he's like over the top or think that it's ridiculous what he's saying. You're like, yeah, if I lived in this fucking world of bleak shit, I would feel the same way as George C. Scott,
I would love to have been like yelled at or scolded at by George C. Scott. He's got such a great, like, angry, gravelly voice.
Yes.
For, like, screaming and yelling at people. Oh, man.
It's not in the file.
Yeah. It's not in the file. Fucking carp.
I love that. Just to bring it back to Seven and stuff, because it's interesting too, because like David Fincher did do music videos and stuff too. I really think that that's what this whole time period is. It's like that making cool imagery into music videos and then kind of incorporating that into
Didn't
film.
Fincher start in music videos too?
Yeah, like commercials and
Nine
music
Inch
videos.
Nails, right?
9 Inch Nails, exactly. And so I'm just kind of bringing it back because this movie does remind me of Seven, and it reminds me of like the last thing that Morgan Freeman says, where he quotes, I forget, like, I don't know, fucking.
The world is a beautiful place, and we should save it. And then he go.
Yeah, he's
and then he says, "I believe it. I believe in the second part."
Right.
Like the world is a great place and it deserves to be saved, but I only believe in the second part.
Right. It's something along those lines, and that's what this movie feels like. It's like it's so miserable and so dark, and so many horrible things happen to George C. Scott too, because Father Dyer is murdered. His good friend is murdered. He was friends with Father Karras from the first film, and he died in this exorcism. So it's just so bleak in general. His own family becomes the target at the end of this movie too.
We didn't even mention the scene where the old woman is like climbing on the fucking roof, like those scenes. Those were, I think, the first scenes that I saw of this movie, maybe on TV when I was really young.
Yeah.
And that scene always creeped the shit out of me. Like the little old lady on the roof, like climbing around.
Yeah.
And I feel like I've seen that scene since, like that kind of idea. Like even with with Hereditary, of
Right.
where Tony Collette scurries across the fucking wall. It reminds me of that.
Yeah. There's tons of movies that have aped that style, and it's so. I'm sure that like seeing that in the theater in like 1990 would have freaked someone the fuck out. You know, I'm telling you, there's something like I almost wish we could almost do like just a channel based on these like early 90s, late 80s movies, like Jacob's Ladder. Like it's just with the fucking imagery and like that
Uh,
feeling of a movie.
well, yeah, no, I mean, we covered. You mentioned People Under the Stairs, but like Shocker also was 1989,
Right,
very
right.
similar. Like 1988 was like a year where I feel like horror movies, especially for me, because that was kind of the year where I started to like really remember going to the video store and seeing like The Exorcist 3 for me. I'll never forget the back of the VHS box, and you saw the cross like coming out of hell with
Oh,
like the arms around it. That scene in the cell at the end,
yeah.
that was on the back of the box, and I was like, "What the fuck is going on in this movie?"
Yeah. I think probably because what happened is in the 80s, like, I think that slashers were kind of dying down and stuff before the 90s. And they're like, well, we need something new. We need something different. And so they start to go in this really dark, kind of demented direction, and like movies that had cool imagery and interesting visuals were starting to like really blow up. Like 1989's Batman was like this tremendous success,
One movie that we're overlooking, which came out in 1991, is The Silence of the Lambs, and that won all the Oscars. But also the similarities in talking to crazy people in like this dark, secluded cell area.
Yeah.
I mean, the only difference between between Kinderman and talking to Patient X slash the Gemini Killer,
Right.
and Clarice talking to Hannibal Lecter, is a glass door and the fact that one might be possessed by the devil.
Right. Listen, we are like giving gold right here if David Weiner is making, the 90s version of In Search of Darkness. He should just
Which
fucking
he is. He keeps. I keep seeing on Twitter recommendations for movies 1990 to 94. Um,
I
I
mean,
love.
David, just like copy and paste this fucking discussion right here, just stick it in there, right? Like, I'll take a credit if you want, but what the hell? Go ahead.
Yeah. No. I was gonna bring up one movie. Did you ever see The Ninth Configuration?
No, what's that?
So the Ninth Configuration. So everybody knows that The Exorcist Part Two is genuinely considered to be like one of the worst movies ever made. It's like the director, who was a decent director, I think John Borman, has like denounced it. William Peter Blatty has no connection to it. It's basically considered to be an absolute mockery. In 1981, William Peter Blatty wrote and directed a movie called The Ninth Configuration, which is based off of a book that he wrote. And it's about this military vet who goes to like a mental institution and takes over the mental institution and basically lets the inmates run the asylum. And
okay.
so many of the actors from that movie are in this movie. The main character of that movie is Scott Wilson, who plays Dr. Temple in this. I think Ed Flanders might have been in it. There's a bunch of the actors who were in this movie, Exorcist III, were in Ninth Configuration. And it's for some reason, it's not very well known. It is streaming for free, I believe, on a variety of platforms. And a lot of people have kind of jokingly referred to that as like Blatty's Exorcist 2, because it's not really about demons or possession, but it's very similar in like the exploration of humanity and like craziness and insanity and, people left, people versus their inner demons. But it's really, really weird and really worth checking out. I'd love to rewatch that movie. I missed it earlier I think in June. It might have been playing at Alamo by me, and I missed
Ah,
it. Yeah.
dude, I'll check it out. Am I imagining this, or is there a movie where it's like it's about the fucking astronaut that goes to the party in The Exorcist? Do you know what I'm talking about? Like,
I remember the scene where the astronaut
right?
is
Because
that
like
the ninth configuration?
I don't know, because like Reagan comes down and like she like pees. Oh, like your family coming up from the pool.
Yeah, it's
Oh,
all
okay.
right. We'll,
Yeah, yeah,
we'll be done in a minute.
yeah. Well, anyway, I'll look into that. Maybe we can talk about it in our next episode. But what else did you want to say about Exorcist 3?
If you haven't seen it, I'm sorry we spoiled it for you, but I think it is at its worst. It's a very, very good companion piece to the original Exorcist, a must see companion piece to the original Exorcist. And at its best, it is comparable. And you might enjoy it more than the
Yeah.
original Exorcist.
Yeah, yeah. I would say that The Exorcist is an iconic film. It definitely changed the landscape of horror. But I think I would rather watch this movie than watch The Exorcist. I mean, just based on the performances alone.
I
Um,
think that my biggest difference is very quickly is that The Exorcist is that slow build and it builds up to this unbelievable climax. The last 15 to 20 minutes of The Exorcist is some of the scariest, most insane stuff you will ever see in a horror movie. This movie, I love the beginning. It is a little bit of slow burn, but you do get those like graphic depictions of what's happening. You get the great dialogue. For me, the last 10 minutes are a little bit of a kind of like I didn't see the movie going in that direction,
right, right.
but it doesn't really hurt it for me. It's still very good, and the performances are great. You get the actors and the characters from the original movie. It's an underseen treat.
Yeah. Amen. Amen. And this is just the beginning of our Exorcist month. Danny and I are going to be covering the Exorcist show, which I believe was on Fox
Yes,
a couple of years ago. And there's 2 seasons of that, right?
I
So
believe so. Yeah,
we're gonna break it.
Chris highly recommended it. I vaguely remember watching season one and liking it, but I don't remember anything about it. So I'm going to rewatch it and we'll see what happens.
Yeah. And so Danny's on vacation. I actually have vacation coming up next week, but we will make sure that we fit in our time to record some stuff. Danny is constantly putting up shorts and reviews. He's on vacation right now, so he hasn't done it this week, but you can check. There's a ton of content on the channel. If you guys have made it all the way to this point in the video and you guys know what I'm talking about with that movie that's like about the pilot from The Exorcist, let us know in the comments too, because that'll save me some time Googling. But we hope that you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure that you subscribe, and we'll talk to y'all real soon.